I am very excited to be here to introduce David Alekhougie. David is a contemporary photographer and a native Angelino, born and raised. He holds a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and a Master's of Fine Art from Yale University. He currently has work at Yancey Richardson Gallery, which he is going to talk to us about today, which should open up some amazing conversation around cultural heritage and authorship. And as Janice mentioned, he is going to be teaching a very special workshop for LACP in July called Mining the Archive, Collages Documentary Practice. And I encourage everyone to go to David's site and read more about the incredible list of shows that he has had, the galleries that he has been fortunate to show his work in. And I look forward to seeing more of that live and direct here in Los Angeles. So David, welcome. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm just gonna talk about my work, but I'm also going to talk about this class that I'm teaching, why it's really important to think about the archive, how you deal with the archive, as well as just a kind of a few philosophical kind of conceptual ideas around the work. So, I'm going to start off with body of work that I just showed at Yancey Richardson Gallery in New York, titled A Reprise. The entire called Naivete, but the title of this specific body of work was A Reprise. And it comes from a jazz reference. In this kind of presentation, I'm going to be talking a lot about music being an influence on my work over the last few years. And so the title of the body of work is a reprise, and they're all based off of archival photographs found in catalogs. One of the catalogs, well, there's the one main catalog based at the Museum of Modern Art in 1955 called Negro African Arts and Sculpture. And a lot of that documentation is done by Walker Evans, was commissioned to do a lot of that documentation. And I feel like it's important to also note that documentary photography in this way, in terms of like art documentation, for example, is like one of the first kind of things that a lot of photographers in doing, you know, as a trade, you know, like making pictures for money, is this kind of like thing that in contemporary art people don't want to talk about, but is often a subject of conversation in the classroom, like how to make money as a photographer. And people get their start doing that in a multitude. It could be, you know, something like journalism, right? Wedding photography. For me, it was art documentation was one of the first things in school that I was able to do to kind of income. Also, like printmaking, that was the thing. So is one of the things that I've been thinking about over these last years is this kind of like this overlap between when a photographer is expressing their own authorship, their own vision, or whether or not they're just a kind of hired gun. They're just doing a job, and you maybe shouldn't hold them accountable for the pictures that they make, or the observations that you see through their photography. So that is like a question that's kind of been in my mind for like the past few years, and it's something that I'm beginning to kind of deal with in this work, because in some ways, how a lot of people write about this work is the fact that he was just a kind of hired gun, a hired photographer, just to kind of do this job and make these pictures. But when I look at the pictures, because another kind of layer of this is the fact that Walker Evans was also one of the first heads of photography at Yale University. So in a lot of ways, passed down through lineage, I'm like a student of Walker Evans, right? So so there's this question of whether or not Evans is doing his kind of distilling an object down to its kind of formal base, something that he's done in other series, or whether or not he's doing the job that he's hired to do. And my question is whether or not like he's actually doing both, and so this was the first kind of catalog that I looked at, Perfect Documents. And I got that catalog as a gift. And what was really interesting to me about it was the title, like this idea that you can make a perfect document. And so with that being said, this idea of a document being perfect for me is really, really ego driven. And it's something that I want to talk about as part of the nature of photography, but also one of its like kind of primary flaws, right? Because like at this point in the game, we all sort of are trained to question the truth in a picture, like a photograph's truthiness is something that we're all kind of prepared to do, but in a lot of ways, we still have this kind of like psychological thing that we do where it's like photographs or it didn't happen. Like the photograph is the proof, and so I was thinking about these Walker Evans photographs, and I was also thinking a lot about Frantz Fanon, which is kind of like an early text around post-colonialism and how we sort of come to resolve a lot of these issues that we have, in colonized countries, or as like a colonized people in a country that maybe used to belong to us that doesn't anymore, or a country, for example, like the US that's like built on colonialism, right? So I'm questioning this idea of whether or not through collage, through a kind of reconsidering of how documentary photography works, you can sort of like actively decolonize a history, or unravel that history so that it's like up for interpretation for everyone, and so I started taking a lot of these photographs and printing them out in the studio and remaking. We're talking about,
there we are.
So this is the work. So we're talking about these photographs. So this is one of my pieces that I made. It's about 40 by 50 inches. And it's sort of based off of like the photographs in this book, Perfect Documents. And so I'm pulling these images out of the book and I'm kind of treating them like sculptural material, because one of the things that is a kind of consequence of being, in this kind of colonized state is the fact that like the original objects I have no access to, right? So my only access to this material, this kind of cultural material, is through the lens of this photographer, Walker Evans, right? So I'm kind of trying to wrestle with that lack of access. And that is something that you see across marginalized people in general. Like, for example, in music, I'm going to talk about like hip hop, in a second, like this idea that you kind of take all of the music out of the schools, and what ends up happening is people start to like sample records, and that becomes, this kind of like rehashing of these kind of same issues that we have with the culture, right? So in a lot of ways, this is kind of sample-based hip hop, but in the form of like photography and sculpture. So I'm taking the images out of the book, you know, and then I'm kind of treating it as a sculptural material and then rephotographing it as if, you know, the sculptures that I made in the studio are on the same kind of playing field as like these original sculptures, right? Because in some sense, these artifacts, you know, they're already ill-gotten gains, right? In a lot of ways, they've been decontextualized from their original past, you know, so even if I were to like walk into the moment, like say, for example, you know, I get a commission to go in the MoMA and photograph these sculptures, which very well may happen, you know, and I get that opportunity, you know, in a lot of ways, it wouldn't be the same as me having access to them, you know, in the realm of them being outside of this kind of institution. So for me, it's more interesting to think about the access that I have as being a person who, in order to understand these sculptures, I have to buy a book on Amazon, wait for it to be shipped to my house, and look at these black and white bitmapped photographs, you know? So these are some of like the original photographs, and this is the photograph that I made. So, and then another thing that I wanted to talk about.
David, I've got a question for you. Do you happen to know with Walker Evans, was any of that documentation how directed or done by committee, or did they leave him to his own practice just to execute?
Own practice. They left him to his own practice. Absolutely. That I do know. You know, and some of I've been collecting different editions of the work and different editions of the book. And in those editions, you can see different strategies for how he's dealing with the material. You know, for example, like this photograph isn't even in the original Negro and African art catalog. So there are pictures that don't make the cut. There are some that do. You know, there are definitely different strategies. For example, like in this picture, it's very graphic, you know, and it's kind of like reminiscent of a lot of his photographs of tools that you see, you know, where it's kind of like really, it's almost flattened into a drawing. And then in some of like the photographs, you can see these harsh shadows that are really, in my opinion, inspired by a lot of like Bauhaus photography, you know? So yeah, and so I wanted to kind of balance these two terms, right? This idea of the artifact and this idea of the archive, because I've been teaching black and white photography, black and white film photography. And one of the things that I'm sure everybody here has noticed is the resurgence of film photography, right? And that has been something that particularly young people have been very interested in. It's been, you know, a question that I've had as to just why this kind of resurgence of film photography, and I feel like part of it has to do with this question of artifact, you know, and by artifact we can kind of think of this term artifact in a bunch of different ways, but in one way you can think of it as what's left behind when you're trying to record something in this transparent way, right? Because like when I came up in photography, I was trying to make the cleanest, the most legible pictures possible. And things like grain, things like dust were things that I was really, really trying to run away from and hide. And one of the things that I've noticed is the fact that we've gotten to a point now where the process of photography is becoming more and more invisible, you know, and in that, I think that there's this kind of inherent anxiety of surveillance, you know, and that's kind of something that we'll be kind of fleshing out more in the course. But this kind of question of artifact, how to kind of leave behind this this idea of interpretation, you know, this idea of looking at something, how to leave behind the residue of the fact that you're looking at something or you've looked at something, you know. And that's something that has been really interesting to me that I was doing, and you know, and the work at the show, you know, like so much of it is about tracing how I've looked at something, you know. And that's something that I feel like people should maybe start to think about in terms of this idea of collage. And so this is a David Hammond's piece, Body Prints, where he's kind of taking his body in ink and making these prints with them, you know. This is kind of like the process, you know. And there's kind of like indexical kind of process that happens where it's like body is becoming this like record of what he's doing in the studio, you know. And it is something that I've seen as being a part of this kind of umbrella of strategies that I've been thinking about from maybe the mid-50s to the present, which is the radical Black avant-garde, you know. And that's something that you kind of see in jazz and hip hop and visual art and film. And there's this kind of desire to be seen, you know, when you're made invisible, you know. And I think that you know, part of this idea of indexicality and kind of performance in the margins is something that I kind of want to talk about in the course. And this is the photograph, you know, banda headdress that is from the first picture. David, so this is like my interpretation of it.
David, I also imagine that in talking about that, you're also talking about who is then holding on to / sharing forward that work that you're talking about, right, that's made in the margins, and how important those spaces are as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So
can you enlighten us a little bit, perhaps, who might be somebody from that era, going way back, who was doing that for the community?
Who was doing that?
Who was starting to keep those archives of the folks that, you know, were working in those
Well, I definitely think that you know, a lot of these artists, you know, I'm thinking about particularly like poets and filmmakers, you know, and musicians especially. One of the artists that I really wanted to talk about that I forgot to put in the slideshow was Roy de Carava's work. You know, has been something I've been thinking about like a lot lately. You know, in terms of like this idea of being a documentary photographer, you know, and photographing these musicians that were operating on the margins, you know, in a lot of ways, like the photographs like mirror that, you know. And yeah, so I think that these ideas are not necessarily, or these strategies are not necessarily new. But what I am trying to really do is look for opportunities to get people comfortable with breaking the rules of documentary photography, right? Because I think that, like I said before, you know, nobody really believes you as like a truth teller, or nobody just takes your word as gospel. Like, I went to this place, I made all these pictures, I went to this event, I made all these pictures, this is what happens because the picture said that. I don't think that people believe that anymore, right? And I think that what's more interesting for me as an artist is to kind of um, talk about not only my viewpoint and to have a kind of sense of self accountability around that, but to also kind of talk about the ways that that viewpoint is distributed or like propagated to like the public, right? You know,
100%,
so
right.
yeah,
Thank you for mentioning that. That was kind of the essence of my question. And I'm thinking of some folks now who, like you said, it's nothing new. We just know how hard the work is to be the keeper of the flame, so to speak, and to
right.
keep those archives. It's a lot of work. And so
Yeah, it's a huge responsibility.
oh,
Yeah.
or to get those communities to keep
I
those
think that there's a lot of
communities on fire.
anxiety there, you know, and I think that there's this kind of there's this looming, and maybe this isn't something that younger photographers deal with, but personally, like what feels like death of documentary photography really terrified me, you know, just because I graduated from grad school in 2015, and I started making pictures like seriously in 2011. And I always wanted to be an art photographer first, but at the same time, I also thought of myself as an archivist. I thought of myself as, you know, at least wanting to take on that responsibility, and that becoming not really dying, you know, becoming like distributed was something I'm still trying to figure out and deal with, right? You know, so
I'm
yeah.
sure you are. And then who, you know, the community that you initially message out to let them know that you're doing that work, and then who, how do they distribute that messaging themselves, right?
Right.
This is one way, having
Mhm.
you here and
Mhm.
reaching out to these organizations, but
Yeah.
for me, that's always kind of the biggest piece of it, which communities are in touch with other communities and how that
Yeah.
expands, hopefully through great intention, like you're doing here through extraordinary intention. Anyway, continue, please.
Yeah, let me just move through some of these. So these are just some of the readings that we're going to be doing. Archive Fever, Jackie's Derrida, and The Death of the Author. Just to kind of talk about this really quick, this is a really interesting book to reread now. It's a little bit dense, but it's worthwhile because in a lot of ways, this is a book that came out in the 90s, and it kind of predicts the advent of social media and email, and you know, we're going to be talking about like this as it relates to kind of like WikiLeaks and the election and all these kind of ideas around the media and how the media has become distributed and personal specifically, you know, and The Death of the Author. This is something that I'm sure a lot of people are pretty familiar with at this point. So, and I also like, we're gonna talk about hip hop a lot. We're gonna talk about music a lot because I feel like music has been the easiest way for me to talk about some of the more formal aspects of the course in terms of like dealing with collage. Like this is an album by Jay Dilla, JD, who's kind of like famous for this idea of a sample-based hip hop soundscape, you know, and as well as like there's three main people that I feel like are the most well known for this. Another is DJ Shadow, who this album Introducing is regarded as the first album that is purely sample based. And it's also like one of the first completely like instrumental sample-based hip hop albums. And then also like this film, Brazilian Time, that has this other person, Madlib, in it, which is also, he's kind of like the keeper of the flame. I like that kind of term of these kind of ideas. So yeah. And
I've actually never seen, I listened to his work many times. I've never seen a photo of him, so it's nice to see that photo.
Yeah. So this film is really interesting because it kind of chronicles him going to Brazil and digging for these funk records, you know, that are really the kind of also like this kind of residue of you know, the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism and stuff. And this is a photograph. This is like a, you know, a photograph that one of my best friends made, and it's based off of like a story. And the reason why I put this picture in here, because like one of the strategies that I want to talk about in the course is this idea of reenactment as like a documentary strategy, you know, akin to collage. And one of the artists that I feel like is most well known for this is Stan Douglas. Like he's a Canadian photographer, and a lot of his work centers around like reenactment. And so this is from a series called Disco Angola, that's based on essentially like what's happening in New York during one period of time and what's happening in Angola during one period of time. And these are some of like the stills, and a lot of these he's kind of in the role of a fictional what would you say, a fictional journalist. And so like these pictures go together. For example, like you have someone in New York that is like watching the dance emergence of disco, and these guys in Angola doing capoeira were well to be a Brazilian thing, but actually started in Angola. And it's all based off of, it's all inspired by this record, Sol Makossa, you know, which is like one of like the first jazz, disco, funk fusion records, you know. So all of this kind of work sprang out of essentially like being inspired by this record, you know. But yeah, this is I'm forgetting. Christian Marclay. Yeah. So we're gonna, you know, go over just different strategies for dealing with archival material, the index. And this is the last slide, the Black Power mixtape. And this is a documentary film that kind of uses this this form of the mixtape to talk about the emergence of the civil rights movement, but like visually. So yeah, this is some of like the material from the course, but yeah, that's all I got.
David, are you asking people to bring something to their first day of the class?
Definitely.
What are you asking them to bring first day?
Photo albums.
Albums, okay.
Yeah, photo albums. If they have them, you know, I do a thing with my design students where it's camera roll, which is far more revealing, you know. But for this, I want to do photo albums because I want to sort of talk about some of the the formal things that we kind of have to deal with as archivists, and how to kind of like turn these opportunities into kind of formal strategies. Like for example, like when you go and get prints from the drugstore, for example, they're always like 4x6. So in my house, a lot of the photo albums have 4x6 prints in them, and like how to kind of deal with that as like a constraint, just different kind of strategies that you can kind of use when it comes to archival material. But yeah, we're gonna start with photo albums.
I was wondering if before we go into Q&A, if you would mind putting up your screen share again and showing some of the examples of your work that you showed at the beginning, because you were explaining a lot of things to us, and then I feel like we didn't get enough opportunity to look. Yeah.
Let me pull that. So yeah, this is some of my work. This one is titled Banda Headdress. And one of the things I was also thinking about with these pictures was modernism in general, and its relationship to cubism and modern painting, like photography's relationship to cubism and modern painting, and the kind of subject of improvisation in modern painting as for me being really owes a lot to the history of jazz, because for me, one of the things that I want to get to in all of my is this idea of photography as labor, the idea of I often think about a photographer as being like akin to like a carpenter or like a mechanic or something, and I feel like historically, and when it comes to the plastic mediums, of like, performing arts, sculpture, painting, I think that photographers have this chip on their shoulders as like people operating in this way that is labor. And I want to talk about the fact that I think that our relationship to labor, for me, is part of what modernism is. You have modernism comes out of our relationship to technology. Our relationship to technology dictates how we grapple with our labor. And the first instance of that for me that I can really build a relationship to is like jazz, right? Like you have a person who's like hired to essentially play military anthems, and you look for this like opportunity to express yourself in this constraint. So you have these constraints, right? And you're looking for an opportunity to express yourself within those constraints. And for me, that's like the most distilled kind of explanation of like how I view modernism, And so this is kind of like also, trying to wrestle with painting as well.
And a lot of photographers, depending on what genre you're working in, can certainly resonate with that, because a lot of those folks who have worked strictly for an outlet, let's say, are given a lot of parameters under which they have to work, but then they're also told to be creative within those parameters to get other things. And then it's oftentimes the photographer's own will only which kind of wins out to show something which is outside of those parameters, because otherwise the people who are hiring them are just going to go for something standard that doesn't, basically bring a new conversation to the fore. So yeah, I appreciate what you're saying there, for very much so. So this one, you showed the the actual piece, which was originally photographed. I would love to see video of you lighting things that you're re-photographing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the lighting is very tricky.
Because it says so much about, the kind of conversations you're asking your audience to have, for sure.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah, definitely. A lot of the photos, the lighting is deliberately confusing or deliberately oriented. Like in this one, for example, you kind of have this sundial like kind of effect that's happening, but it also has like drop shadow that alludes to the fact that the light is coming from another direction altogether, and that comes from this idea of like looking at a picture at different times, like maybe looking at it like maybe looking at something during one period and looking at something during another period. And for me, like interesting thing to think about, like this idea that you know looking at something in 1935, for example, looking at something in 2020 is going to change it formally, is something
100%.
that
My
I wanted to
perspective,
allude to.
for the viewer, I mean, my first perspective is to just keep wanting to look and look again and look again and look again, because I feel like there's something that maybe I'm not seeing if I don't spend enough time with it. And those are, it's very challenging in the best possible way. Very cool. Please show another one, and then LACP has asked me to ping you with a couple of questions so we can kind of get to know David, who's the non-working David, kind of behind the scenes. But please, please show us this and talk a little bit more about this.
Yeah, this one is a female figure, and so this one, for example, like it has like this backdrop, and the backdrop is from these fabrics that I bought in Kenya called like shuka fabrics. They're these like acrylic fabrics that are typically worn by Maasai tribes people, and they have this grid, that you like see on the fabric. And one of the things that I was thinking about is the idea that kind of like grid could function as a way to kind of allude to scale, but not like explicitly. Like in the background, I don't know if it's like visible, but like you see the scale of like a cutting mat, like a paper cutting mat, like where you would typically photograph something like on a copy stand, where they have like the measurements of like how big something is or how small something is. And I wanted to kind of like use that fabric as a way to kind of talk about the grid as being about that, but also disorient the viewer from its capability to serve that function. So in a lot of ways, like you look at it and you're driven to figure out the scale because of the grid, but you're also not really given what the scale is, and that's what I was thinking about in regards to, and that's just like something I've been thinking about in regards to this gridded fabric. But also the other aspect of it is the fact that like one strategy I could have taken making this work, and it's something I've been asked before, whether or not like the fabrics correspond to the location of the sculpture, and they do. They don't at all. And the reason that is because I wanted to kind of talk about this idea of a colonized culture being fundamentally hybridized. I wanted to talk about the experience of going to somewhere like Nigeria, for example, and growing up, I had these kind of misconceptions of like how people spoke, right? Like what language do you do? Like say, for example, if you're from South Africa, or you're from Kenya, you're from Nigeria, or you're from Ghana, like what language do you speak? What is your sort of native tongue? And more often than not, in a lot of colonized places, you will find various forms of pidgin and patois, which are fundamentally hybridized languages, right? And that's something that I wanted to talk about visually. It's something I've been thinking about for a really long time as being like a gift and a curse of like marginalized people in general, so
I like this very much. It sounds like a very natural extension of your other work, for sure, exploring that. Because the labor involved, the times people have to speak pidgin as a way of either not directly code switching, but just being able to get a message across.
Yeah.
I like hearing that you're going to,
or the fact that like you have various tribes, right? You have Yoruba people, you have Edo people, you have Igbo people, and there's all this kind of overlap that happens with pidgin, right? And that's a kind of consequence of colonialism, right? So yeah, under British rule. So
right. Can we talk in this space, or can we not talk in this space openly? Yeah. There's that.
It's something you see, in the Caribbean too, in Brazil. I mean, really, it's a phenomenon, that you see globally, and so it's very beautiful, very beautiful thing. And so
it is. It keeps certain things alive, which would otherwise be squashed out. Yeah. Thank you for sharing this, and thank you for being here today and sharing your time. Would you be willing to maybe tell us, because you have touched on it a little bit, tell us what part of the world you would love to visit that you haven't yet seen?
I haven't been to Accra yet. I haven't been to Ghana yet. I would love to go to Ghana. For just obvious reasons. Like, I mean, I would love to go to Brazil. The main reason why, though, is not because it was along the Atlantic slave, because I've always wanted to visit everywhere that's been along the transatlantic slave route. I've wanted to visit all of those places, but the reason I wanted to go to Brazil is because like I'm a pretty avid martial artist, and I wanted to go there to train jiu-jitsu, and that's something I'll probably do this year. Also Thailand. I wanted to go to Thailand to train martial arts as well. So yeah, that's
Thailand, I have not been.
That's kind of my main places. Thailand, Brazil, Ghana.
Thailand, I've not been. Brazil, I have, and it remains one of my great memories. I was there with a number of college friends, one of whom moved down there permanently several years ago. So if and when you go, I'll have to make certain that you can reach out to her. And
Yeah.
she has been a longtime practitioner of capoeira herself. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I want to get to some Q&As from the audience before we say goodbye. So let's see. I see Matthew Finley, who also participates very extensively and moderates some of these talks himself, asked a question. And his question is, in talking about labor, does play, the actual play, factor into your process?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I think yes, absolutely. And it's interesting because I've been thinking about improvisation, right, as this form of protest, right? Like for example, you know, I'm sure the first jazz soloist was in protest. They were like, I'm playing this military tune, and I'm gonna be in key, and I'm gonna get from point A to point B, but I'm gonna do it my way. And I'm just thinking about psychologically that as like a form of protest, and I've been thinking about that as a form of protest, but I also think it's like a form of play as well, you know, of like understanding like a set of rules, you know, and trying to bend those rules or move through this kind of space in a way that is joyful. And play is super important. It's something that it's a good question. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially like when it comes to, you know, this idea of music and DJing and all this kind of stuff, like finding the opportunity, like finding the joy, you know, in a kind of structured situation, you know, is yeah, it's super important, you know. I have to write about that more for sure. Yeah.
Thanks for asking that question, Matthew. That is really great. I do not see any other questions in the chat, but I would love to see another one from those of you that are out there, participants. Now is your chance. Ask your questions. And while I'm waiting for another question, David, I'll ask you one last question. How do you feel about what's one profession other than photography that maybe you would have enjoyed or still may enjoy?
Architecture. I always wanted to build buildings. I always wanted to also, I always just wanted to be a designer. I always wanted to design things like, yeah, maybe like work as a designer, you know, like in a broad sense, you know, whether it's like architecture or like furniture or fashion. I've always wanted to work in fashion. So yeah, and also engineering. I always wanted to be a kind of like hacker guy, computer electrical engineer.
So are there things that you design on the side or something that maybe
yeah, it's I feel like my work is branching out into designed objects as well.
Yeah,
but
excellent.
yeah, it's you know,
anything you can talk about?
Not really right now without the pictures. It would be like difficult to talk about without like actual work, you know. So
okay, had to ask. Well, here is one other question that comes from Sarah Hadley, who all of you should know is at LACP and handles bringing in all sorts of great marketing and development. She asked, can you talk about some of your older series like Pull Up and Baptism and how those inform your current interest in archives.
Right, right, right. Well, pull-up specifically came primarily from a lot of these questions that I had about modernism. I had become really interested in questions around abstraction, abstract expressionism specifically, and landscape, like this idea of the body as a landscape, or the idea of finding your own sense of identity in the landscape. So yeah, the pull-up series became, for me, really like an investigation into this concept of this kind of really traditional concept of the sublime, right? This idea that the landscape in and of itself is in a lot of ways like unknowable, or monumental in a way that is beyond our understanding, but we still have a desire to conquer and possess it. And like, I think that that's what we do to like each other, particularly like,
In fact, David, if you
yeah.
wouldn't mind unsharing your screen, I'll share my screen because I have your pull-up series from your website. So I want to be able to show people.
Cancel. Okay, cool.
Okay. So I'll go bigger. So please, I just want to be able to show, while you're talking.
I update my website.
Mm-hmm.
One of these days, I'm gonna do that. But yeah, really, these are color fields. Is how I think about them, as color fields. I think about them as landscapes. I don't think that you can really pinpoint whether or not the figure are male or female, but we sort of like have these signifiers that point to the idea that they are male, and that's also like part of the work. Mm-hmm. Like the idea that you can kind of build an idea of what something is, in your mind without actually knowing what it is, in this kind of hyper realized like detail. Like in some of these photographs are very large scale. They're shot with like a large format camera, and it's what Stephen Shore would call like this kind of hyper awareness, is what I wanted to kind of get to in these pictures, but they're also like quite abstract, so yeah, these pictures are about landscape. They're about landscape. They're about the body as landscape. They're about the sublime, they're about our kind of sexual kind of I think that our relationship to the sublime is a sexual one as well, but yeah.
In fact, an idealized. And then this one, you chose to use a mannequin. So can you talk a little bit about that choice?
Well, I wanted to kind of talk about this idea of like a form that maybe didn't have an identity, like an idealized form, and some of the other work from this, I'm working with these like concrete mannequins, and in a lot of ways they're like you can think of them as like a collective gravesite or something, like and a lot of the work kind of going forward, I think that the work is not only about the body of landscape, but it's also like about mourning, and the fact that like say for example, like when you go out and you see flowers next to like concrete with like no name, you just see candles and stuff, right? Because people might not have the ability to kind of mourn in another way, you know what I mean? Or that might be like the way they choose to kind of mourn, you know? I want to talk about this idea of a site as being universal, but also personal at the same time, you know? So that's the reason why it's impossible to kind of say to yourself that this is about like this person or that person. It is about like people collectively, you know, and also like how people are viewed collectively, you know, like this is what these types of guys are like. This is how these types of guys dress, for example, you know. So that's why it was really fitting to kind of use a mannequin, almost as if like you could plug anybody into that, you know.
In fact, being able to have many conversations around what it is we're looking at, right? It's tremendous. And this was, when did you first put this work out? What year was it?
Yeah, it was 2017. I showed it with my longtime gallerist Kevin Kim in 2017. He had a space called Stephen MacArthur, and yeah, that was like one of my first Los Angeles solo shows, was this work.
Where is that gallery?
It's no longer, we kind of partnered with Commonwealth and Council now, so now I'm represented by Commonwealth and Council Los Angeles.
Okay.
So yeah, but this is the space.
There's the space. That's great to see. I'm so glad you included that, so then viewers who just are coming to your site and only seeing that for the first time can see the scale at which.
Yeah, I gotta do my website. My website is like, I haven't even looked at it in a while.
Oh, we all do, right? It's never done.
Well, I think the problem is I always want something like really like cool and like hip and stuff, and it's like a tall order, you know? So I'm just like, maybe I'll do that later. Maybe I'll get some help.
Maybe do it. Did you, Sarah asked about baptism, so I'm gonna click on that now.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that work. Yeah, so baptism. So that really, so I was in school, right? And I was making all this kind of super conceptual work that was really almost like every picture was like almost like a one-off, it felt like, you know, like every picture revolved around this singular kind of idea. And so initially, you know, the impetus was to kind of make something that was in dialogue with my family, you know, and I started thinking about tracing both of my like parents' like lineage, like where they were from, where their parents were from, like, and I had kind of settled on this idea of migration, you know. I had settled on this idea of thinking about Atlanta specifically as being a kind of mecca, you know, for Black entrepreneurship. And I had started to treat Atlanta as a kind of you know, epicenter, or kind of you know, a place where the civil rights movement really starts to kind of take shape, you know, being like Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthplace as well. So baptism was really like a going to like Mecca, you know, like going to Martin Luther King's birth site. So that was the kind of like impetus for the work, and this idea of so yeah.
So you mentioned, I paused you when you had mentioned about how MLK's birthplace was Atlanta.
Yeah, this is actually a photograph of Martin Luther King's birth site. So yeah, and it's also like in the style of a Walker Evans photograph, you know. So yeah, in a lot of ways, this is kind of like this secular kind of tracing around Sweet Auburn, Atlanta, thinking about this idea of the civil rights movement coming out of the Black church. And I also visited the archives. And in the archives, it kind of like talks about a lot of the kind of anxiety of being a religious leader in a political moment, you know, and the responsibility of that. And that's something that I was really interested in as well. It's kind of like sense of self-doubt as a leader, and that being really almost like reaffirming for me. You know, this is like a preserved slave cabin in Atlanta. And this is one of the first Black businesses in America. This is an insurance, like a insurance building. And this is like inside the preserved slave cabin. And this is
How did you
inside.
know? How did you know about the insurance building? Had you been making lists of, you know?
Yeah. Well, I was visiting the archives a lot. I was visiting the archives in Sweet Auburn, and you can kind of look at a lot of his like journals, and you know you can get research on the civil rights movement in Atlanta. And so I was doing a lot of research, but I was also just like walking around and making pictures on my way to the birth site, you know. So yeah, like that's like what this work is about. That's why I call it baptism. This kind of you know, sense of learning about who you are, you know. In a lot of ways, I did the same thing when I went to Africa for the first time. That was also like a type of baptism, you know. But yeah, this is some of my favorite work, actually. This is one of my favorite pictures. But yeah.
Thank you, Sarah, for asking those questions. I had looked at that work. I was glad you're asking him to bring that up, because we often just talk about the current, but
yeah.
it's important
Takes
to
me
see.
back. This is 2012, 2013. Yeah, most of it is 4x5, medium format film.
Can you talk about the choice of overlaying the color on that one? And
So this actually like was a processing error, you know. Yeah, this is a picture outside of the church, and I ended up processing color film with black and white processing, and it ended up like screwing up like everything. And when I scanned it, I ended up with like some of these crazy colors. It happened one other time as well, like maybe like a couple years ago, where I got the same effect, you know, from like it only really happens when I scanned it on the Epson scanner for some reason.
I was going to say, you're taking me back. And when you started to say that, yeah, I had a memory from a long time ago of first transitioning from shooting film at press events, but then moving to digital. It was about scanning, and we did use an Epson scanner. So I'm probably up there. Yeah. Wow. But it was so effective, and to help tell your story, so you kept it.
Yeah.
What are we looking at here?
Well, let me see if I can stop these because they're going super fast. See, this is why I need to, when I click on it, it should like just stay, right?
Stop, yeah.
I can't make it do that. It just goes all fast. Yeah, but this is a preserved slave cabin. So
Okay.
this is a preserved slave cabin in Atlanta. On the not this isn't in Atlanta. This is on like the outskirts. So yeah.
Who's preserving it? What
I
institution?
forget. I think it's private. I'm pretty sure it's private. I gotta go back and look at the documentation. Um, but yeah, I'm kind of like hesitant to even talk about it too much because I feel like I might get in trouble behind that. you know? Yeah, because I remember it being just like a privately owned thing that you can like go and take a look at, you know? So yeah. So
Well,
I wouldn't want to, you know, cause issues. But anyway,
I'm glad you're sharing it though.
yeah. This is Andy's feet. This is a sculpture outside of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, so which was his father's church and his home church, where he kind of like started his practice. That's where inside this is inside Ebenezer Baptist Church. This is also like on the outskirts of Atlanta.
I'm really
So in a
appreciating.
lot of ways, it's a kind of travelogue, you know. I think about it in the same way. It's really like in the style of road photographers, you know.
It is.
I've been thinking about, you know, a lot of the kind of concepts, you know, around being a kind of wandering photographer. I think that I was thinking a lot about um, Robert Frank at the time as well. I was thinking a lot about beat poetry, for example. I was thinking a lot about, you know, those kind of figures in the 70s, you know, those photographers in the 70s, like you know, Stephen Shore, Mitch Epstein. I was thinking a lot about, you know, the
And
road photography, you know, and I was kind of like marrying it with this idea of like Mecca, you know. So like going to Mecca, like this thing that you do, you know, when you become an adult, or when you know, come to like understand your like part of understanding like who you are, and in many people like their faith, right? Like is this idea of Mecca, you know.
what I'm
So
appreciating very much is that you are not only showing detail, but you're pulling all the way back to let the viewer, the first time viewer, really see the scope of the space that you're in a lot of times. And that's, I always feel that it's always so important for the first time viewer to really help bring them in to this story that you're telling and you're trying to show them. Because without showing both, sometimes I think not enough is shared. So this is phenomenal. Yeah, phenomenal. David, thank you. My God, thank you so much for taking this time with us. And I am so excited to share the word about your workshop that's coming up in July.
yes.
Please let our audience know any, you know, things that you want them to know about the workshop, and then we will say goodbye for now.
About the workshop, sign up. It's gonna be dope. We're gonna have fun, talk about real stuff, and it'll be good. It'll be good. It'll be good. It'll be great. Yeah, yeah.
No doubt.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for coming to the presentation. Tell your friends next time because we're going to be doing these live and in person before we know it. I don't know a date because I haven't asked LACP yet, but I look forward to when they make those sort of announcements too. Thanks, everybody. Thanks.